Thank you, and thanks for that very very kind introduction. It's great to be here. So yeah, my name is Sian Bayne. I'm Professor of Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh. As Joyce kindly said, I direct the Centre for Research in Digital Education at Edinburgh, and I also have a kind of university institution-wide role as Assistant Principal for Digital Education. I tell you that because that's kind of the project that I want to talk about today. The Near Future Teaching Project comes from that role. So yeah, I come from the beautiful city of Edinburgh. If you haven't been there yet, please come. Particularly if you can get there this week, where the weather is quite good. Otherwise, bring a jumper and several waterproofs. I want to set a little bit of context about the university, so that it can help you make sense of what it is that I want to say in the rest of the keynote this morning. Edinburgh is a large research-intensive university, usually ranking about 20th in the World League tables. It's huge. We have a community of 50,000 people, of which 40,000 are students at undergraduate and postgraduate level. Particularly relevant for what I want to say today, and I think to the interests of this conference, are that we have had a long kind of history now of investment in educational technology and digital education, which is quite unusual for a kind of research-intensive ancient university, ancient European university. So we have already about 4,000 online postgraduate students. These are students who are completely online, and they constitute about a third of our entire postgraduate student body, so that is quite significant, and they're distributed across 60 online master's programs across all disciplines. And we were one of the first European universities to really get into doing MOOCs, and from 2013 we've started to launch our MOOCs portfolio. We now have about 50 and 2 million learners on those, which I find fantastic as a way of thinking about the extended community of the university. So that's where I'm coming from. But this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the Near Future Teaching Project, which was a project, as Joyce kindly said, to kind of try and bring a values basis into our strategic thinking and planning for the future of digital. So in order to get to the point where I'm going to talk about near future teaching, I'm going to sort of do some a bit more contextualizing and provide a bit more of a rationale based in the academic literatures and others about why we felt we needed to run a project called Near Future Teaching. So this is what I'm going to be talking about this morning. I'm going to start by giving some perspectives of researchers on the ways in which, as academics, we tend to think about what we're doing when we talk about the future of education. I'm going to flag some ways in which I think the dominant stories that are told about the future of education and technology are often very problematic, and I'll explain why I think that's the case in a minute. And then I'm going to make the argument that we need to, as researchers, as academics, as practitioners, as support staff working in education, I think we need to find ways of telling better stories about the future of technology and education, which is where the Near Future Teaching Project comes in. So to start with, I'm going to just give a couple of slides giving some of the academic kind of basis for what I want to say by talking about perspectives on the future of education. Education is a very future-facing activity. We know this. You know, we are, as educators, we are preparing future generations for a healthy society, whatever differences there might be in how we define what counts as a healthy society. That's what we're doing. We're preparing for the future. But we're often actually not very good as academics at kind of articulating what we think the future of education is, or what the future of education is for. So there's a wonderful paper by Kerry Facer, who's an academic based at Uppsala University in Sweden, where she talks about using the future in education as a way of creating space for openness, hope, and novelty. And she's quite critical of the ways in which we tend to think about the future as educators at the moment, because she says that in the policy documentation, in some of the strategic documentation in this area, there's often a tendency to think that education is about optimizing students' fitness for the future. So this kind of sees the future as an unfolding landscape of what she calls cost-benefit analysis and choice. And our job as educators is to teach our students so that they're best equipped to make the decisions they need to make to succeed in this particular future. Again, there's a lot that's fine about that particular vision, but it does kind of see education as a kind of instrument, as a tool, which often is not particularly helpful. The second kind of big conceptualization that Facer has is education as colonization. So we are educating in a way which is making us fit for a future which looks pretty much like the present. So we're colonizing the future from the basis of where we are right now. So we're teaching our students, for example, to take up jobs that may not exist in 20 years' time. We know that we're living in a rapidly changing kind of employment context. We know that there are big changes that are coming our way around climate, around technology, around demographic shifts, around borders. So it's really not enough to talk about education as though it's going to be the world is going to be business as usual in the next 20, 50, 100 years. And the final version of the future that she talks about is this one of protection. And she quotes H.G. Wells talking about civilization as being a race between education and catastrophe. As an educator myself, I quite like this one because it makes us sound like we're kind of at the leading edge, we're what's standing between society and catastrophe. And to an extent, we are. But again, I think this view is a little bit problematic because it doesn't take account of things beyond education that are also important, like social justice, equity, climate, and so on. So those are all kind of interesting ways of thinking about what we're doing as future-facing educators, and they're all problematic in certain ways. I think when we drill down to thinking about education and technology specifically, it often gets even more problematic. And the paper I want to draw on here is one by Hamilton and Friesen back in 2013, where they talked about the dominant sort of narratives or stories that we tell about the relationship between technology and education, or technology and society. And they say we talk about this in two ways. We talk about either technology as instrumental. So this is the view, this is the kind of technology as tool discourse, where technologies are seen as neutral, as a way of achieving ends which are already determined by their users. We see this a lot in the policy literatures, technology toolkits, for example, or technologies as solutions to particular problems. So that's one view. The other view that they highlight is this one of determinism, where technology is seen as driving social practice and change, including education, and humans have to adapt as technology kind of plows ahead. And we see this a lot as well in some of our policy literatures around things like harnessing the power of AI, or teaching the upcoming generation of digital natives. These are all determinist perspectives. The problem with these two perspectives is that they put the social here and they put the technological over here, and they don't emphasize what we know to be the case, which is that society and technology develop together and iterate with each other and emerge through and with each other. And this kind of, when we talk about education and technology, we often assume that that isn't the case, that technology is some sort of a kind of add-on or is driving us in a particular way. So having set the scene there for the kind of academic sort of perspectives on this that I've been using, I want to flag a few of some problematic futures. And I think these are futures that these particular approaches, particularly the instrumental and determinist approaches, have kind of led us towards. This is an example I use quite often because I think it's really powerful. It's one of the future-facing kind of visions put forward by IBM about 5 years ago, actually. It was called the IBM 5 in 5 series. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you. And this was the one that they put out for what the classroom would look like in 5 years' time. And I'm not sure, I'm going to read some bits of it out because the text is quite small, but what they're saying, this is a kind of, they're envisioning the kind of smart classroom, the Internet of Things, analytics, and the way these are going to converge to change the way that we teach. And they say things like, in 5 years, the classroom will learn about each individual student and provide a tailored curriculum from kindergarten through to employment. They say the classroom will create a syllabus based on individual learning style and pace. The classroom of the future will learn about individual students over the course of their education and help them master the skills critical to meeting their goals. And all this sounds kind of reasonable enough, and then you realize actually what they've kind of done is they've taken out where we might have said the teacher will do something and replaced it with the classroom will do something or the system will do something. So for example, as educators, we might say actually the teacher of the future will learn about individual students and help them master the skills they need, or the teacher will identify students who are most at risk and then help them. So this to me is indicative of a kind of problem that we see quite a lot in educational technology, which is the kind of disappearance of the teacher, the erasing of the teacher and of teacher professionalism, and replacing it with sort of technology solutions. And to me, this is problematic because it means that a lot of the kind of stories we're telling about the future of education and technology don't include teachers. And a lot of those stories are not told by teachers, they're told by developers or corporations or investors in technology infrastructures. So I want to just start to try and push back a little bit on this. Another example I find quite helpful in making this argument is this one, was Brain Co. This is an example used by my colleague Ben Williamson, who talks a lot about a future in which intimate data, by which he means brain data, is used to drive analytics to look at student engagement and learning. So BrainCo is a spin-off from Harvard University, and it promises that it's going to it's developing these brainwave detecting headbands and software that can track students' engagement in real time. And then what it promises to do is to send real-time brain feedback to lecturers, to the lectern, and give them a visualization of how engaged their audience is. You know, we know, anyone who stood up in front of a class and talked knows whether people are engaged or not. And you know it by looking at the audience and getting a sense of how you think they're doing or how your students are doing. So it's not that this is particularly, I'm sure there is an awful lot that neuroscience can do for us as educators, but it needs to do it from an understanding of what constitutes teacher professionalism and the capacities of the teacher to understand their students. And that doesn't do this. It's one of those, and there are lots of examples of this kind of solutions without necessarily a problem. And my final example is one of facial recognition. This is another story that we hear told a lot, and we know that facial recognition technologies are being implemented in some universities as well as in other parts of society. And there's often this kind of assumption that this kind of something like facial recognition will become part of the ways in which we manage space within universities, within schools, or that we manage attendance. And it's really problematic. There was a blog post on this on the JISC website. JISC, for those that don't know it, is the sort of government-funded body which supports educational technology development in the UK, in universities and further education colleges. And they did this big kind of future-facing think piece about the intelligent campus and how it could work. You can't see it here because the text is too small, but it says students are going to enter the lectures, they'll be scanned, the camera will recognize their faces and match them with an image held on the student record system. That student will be identified as present at the lecture. The camera then records the audience several times during the session, ensuring that students attend the full lecture. Following the lecture, the student attendance record is then used to provide reports to the Home Office and the Student Loans Company as required. And then, as a bit of an add-on, the attendance data is used to help build a picture for the students' engagement and well-being, along with coursework submissions and so on. So again, apart from the way that this is somehow unproblematically seen as part of the normalization of an infrastructure of surveillance within universities, it's also really not taking account of the role of the teacher in understanding whether students are coming to class, how engaged they are, what their well-being, how well they're feeling, how they're succeeding. So this is my kind of summary of some of the problematic ways. And I know there's lots of good stuff out there as well, and I don't want to suggest there isn't, but I think there are some troubling stories that we tell ourselves about the future of education. I'm just going to stop talking for a bit and hand over to you and suggest if you just take maybe 2-3 minutes to talk to your neighbour and maybe talk about what other stories do we tell, in your view, about the future of educational technology, which you think are problematic. So just turn to your neighbour and I'll give you 3 minutes and then maybe come back to see if anyone has any good stories to tell. So this kind of leads me, thank you, because this leads me really nicely onto the next part of my talk, which is really about what do we do as institutions, as academics, as teachers, to tell better stories about the future of education, and stories that are based in our values as educators rather than in the corporate values of techno-rationalism, if you like. So that's where the Near Future Teaching Project came from, this desire to tell better stories. Our aim was very much not to, often future studies are about predicting the future. This was very much not about predicting the future. It was about working across the whole community of the university to co-design a values-based future for digital education. And I think that's really core. This is about what are the values of the institution that we want to take into a tech-enriched future, not what are the values of the tech corporations that we're being told we should be working with. So this is what we set out to do. And the project started in 2017. I thought it would take 1 year. It actually took over 2 years because although it's easy to say you're going to co-design a values-based future with an entire institution, it actually is really hard and takes a long time. We use the kind of, if anyone's done any kind of basic design thinking methodology, will know about this double diamond approach where you start with the question that you want, and our question was, what is our preferred future for digital education at our university? And then you go out and you talk to people to further define the question, and you let it get really messy. So you start from a clear point, then you go out, you talk, you let the data make things really messy, and then you bring it back into a kind of a point of discovery, if you like. For us, that point was about defining community values. And then you go into a second diamond, which is to think about how you're going to reach the particular future that you've determined as being preferable. So that was the kind of overall kind of way in which we managed this project. I'm just going to break down the methodology a bit more, not in too much detail, but just enough to give you a sense of how we actually did this. We started by defining our question, which I already said is, what is our preferred future as a community of scholarship for digital education? We then went on to think about what values do we want to shape this future, and then also importantly, what are the global trends which are going to be impacting on that future that we will have to engage with. And to do this, we entered a big period of community scoping, where we went and talked to an awful lot of people, and I'll say a bit more about how we did that in a minute. But we also mapped trends, and I'll say a bit more about that too. Once we'd done that and we'd started to kind of pin down the values that we wanted to bring to bear on this piece of work, we had to design kind of future speculative worlds as kind of think pieces. So we developed the values and we said, well, how would we apply these values in 20 years' time in a world which is increasingly run by data, for example? So I'll say a bit more about those future worlds in a minute as well. From that piece of work, we defined our values, we defined the preferred future for our institution, and then we went on to develop the aims and objectives that we needed to put in place to get to that future. We tested those aims and objectives with school kids and with students and academics within the university, and then we defined a set of actions which would enable us to get to that future. So it was a long, really creative, quite messy, but really interesting process. So I thought for the rest of my talk, I'm just going to say a bit more about how we did it and where we got to in terms of the values that we defined and the aims and objectives that we came up with. The final report from this piece of work is available on the Near Future Teaching website. I'll give you the link at the end, but if you just Google Near Future Teaching, you'll find it, should you want to. So this period at the beginning of community scoping and mapping trends was quite challenging because with a big community of 40,000 people, how do you scope and extract a set of coherent values from such a big group of people? We did it partly by running events. Over a period of a year, we ran a lot of events, quite small events, workshops. Some of them were focused on technology, so we ran workshops on blockchain and the future of accreditation, on Internet of Things on campus and so on. We got people to come to these workshops, we field noted them, we wrote blog posts about them, we summarized the kinds of things people were saying on our website. But we also ran more speculative kind of values-oriented sessions as well. So, for example, we ran one session with the Black and minority ethnic group within the university, and they developed a manifesto for the future of teaching and learning, which really helped us think about how we define inclusion and diversity. We hooked up with our library and ran a sort of sub-project on the near future library and so on. And then at the end of that process, we looked at where we'd missed, who had we missed. So the University of Edinburgh we have 3 colleges. We have arts, humanities, and social science. We have science and engineering, and then we have medics and the vets. And we realised by the end of this process we hadn't really spoken to any medics or vets because they're just so busy. They couldn't get out much to our events. So we ran events specifically for the medical students and the veterinary students. In addition to that, we spent a lot of time out and about across the campus, and the campus at Edinburgh is very spread out across the whole city, talking to students and academics and doing short video interviews, little vox pop interviews. We had hours and hours and hours of interview record after the end of that process, and we edited them down into 3-minute kind of thematically clustered videos. And again, these are available on our website if you're interested to see them. But people were talking really interestingly, yes, about the technology and about the futures for data and automation and so on, but also about the values. It came through very clearly that people didn't want to see the university as being run like a business. They saw the university as being more than that. They wanted a set of values which were about diversity, about feeling safe at university, and about affordability. There was a sense that sometimes there's too much tech or tech for no good reason, and we captured all this in these videos. We also mapped the trends. So me and my colleague Michael Gallagher wrote 2 short trend reports on educational and social trends, but also on science and technological trends. Those are available on the website too. From doing that piece of work, we realized that these were the kinds of issues that we were going to be working with in the future. A kind of decline of trust in public institutions like universities, an aging population, growth of interest in lifelong learning, the unbundling of universities, the taking apart of campuses in certain ways, a focus on equity and inclusion, automation and urbanization. And then in terms of the technological trends, these are the ones that it was clear that we're primarily working with. We were never very specific about the kind of future horizon that we were working to in this project. When people said, well, what kind of what are you talking, 20, 30, 50, 100 years? We tried not to answer that question, because I think anyone who works with educational technology knows that you're going to, if you try and predict the future, you'll fail. So we just said, well, we're looking at a kind of broad time frame of the next few decades, and these were the technologies that we thought we were working with. So at that point, we were then able to define our values and our preferred futures. These are the values that we came up with at the end of that period of work. It took us about a year, but it became very clear that people wanted a focus on experience over assessment. So students in particular felt that they were being over-assessed. There were too many exams. There was too much marking and performance measurement. And actually, they said, when we get to university, we just want time to think and to take risks and to have a really rich experience as students. So that was one of our values. Another one was on diversity and justice. Unsurprisingly, people were saying, we want this to be an inclusive university. And one interesting thing that came out of that was this idea of diversity, not as something that the university caters to, but as something that the university is driven by. So people were saying, we have this massively diverse international group of students and academics. Let's kind of use that to do things that we couldn't otherwise do. People wanted relationships to be placed at the center of all decision making about educational technology. So they didn't want tech that makes drive space between academics and students, or between students and their peers. They wanted relationships. They wanted technology that helps build strong relationships. And they wanted this focus on participation and flexibility. Students wanted to be involved in designing curricula. They wanted much more flexible journeys through universities, and so on. So these were the values that we worked to for the rest of the project. So in order to kind of think about how we applied these values, we had to devise these kind of future worlds. We had to think really speculatively and about what the future might look like, what kind of future might we have to design the university for, and how would we design it according to the values that we had pinned down. So I just want to spend 10 minutes talking about what those worlds were, because this was quite a problematic and difficult part of the whole project, because it was really difficult to think about what world are we going to be working in 20, 40, 50 years, and how these values that we've developed in 2019, how might these values continue to hold in these unknown futures. So what we did is we developed we worked with a design company to do this. We developed 4 very speculative future worlds. This is the first one. It was a world in which everything is driven by data. So data is everywhere. Every decision that is made is a data-driven decision. We're highly data-dependent in the ways in which we manage all our kind of social interactions, including teaching. It's a highly marketized world where the university is competing globally with other big institutions. online has become not so much a kind of sideline, but it's actually core and integral to the way the university works. But it's a very divided educational context. So access to education is very open. Anyone can take courses online, but there's a premium for students who want to come to the university and actually have human tutor input. So there's a very divided context as well. So that was the first world we thought about. The second one was a world which is really defined by human and machine interdependence. So it's become, in this world, it's become really quite hard to see where the human stops and the technology starts. And again, for all of these, you can say we're already there to some extent. So a lot of work has been automated in this world, so students are much more time-rich. People want to extend their learning across a whole lifetime. There's a strong element of human-machine hybridity. So, for example, every academic tutor works with their own personal AI who helps them teach their students. Students come to university with strong personal missions. It's strongly experience-driven higher education, but it's also a bit troubled. It's troubled because we have become unclear about what the value of being human is in this particular future. So a lot of the education we do in this future is about thinking about what is specifically valuable about the human. So that was the second world, speculation, thought experiment. The third one was around the platform university and Uberification. So imagine if all the universities have become subject to this kind of gig economy. It's the platform university. We don't really have campuses anymore or institutions anymore. We have individual academics who are kind of like the entrepreneurial academic who can build fantastic communities of students around them and make an absolute fortune. Or we have the academic, there are no contracts anymore. For people to start up as academics, it's incredibly difficult. It's highly precarious. Everything's very individualized. It's all about the power of the individual, either to buy education or to provide education. That was the third one. And the fourth one, and everyone thinks this is the kind of utopia one, but I'm not so sure. We tried to keep it more balanced. This is, imagine if in the future all the decisions that we made were about alleviating climate change, for example. So imagine all university activity, all social activity is focused on sustainability. Universities become highly impact focused. Everything is about climate preservation. Where would that leave the humanities, for example? There would be questions to be asked there if everything was focused on demonstrable impact. Highly practice oriented, a strong open and sharing ethos. That was our fourth one. So what I'm going to do now, and I've not done this before, and I hope it's going to work, but I was going to suggest that you talk to your neighbour again to try to understand what it was like trying to map our values onto these particular futures, and just maybe think about what it would look like in a future world where every action and objective is focused on fixing the climate. What would educational technology look like in your institution or in your work if that was the case? So I'll give you another 2 or 3 minutes and then come back and see where we've got to. Yeah, thank you. Anyway, that was interesting, but that was an interesting conversation, but also you can see how the kind of work that we did over the kind of final 6 months of the project, which was to really intensively workshop these various futures with staff and students, was quite challenging in terms of surfacing actually actionable ideas about what we do next. But we did do that. We developed a set of aims and objectives, and we went out and we tested them with school kids because we wanted to talk to future students as well as current students. So we did quite a bit of work in schools local to the area to talk about the aims and objectives and values that we'd surfaced during this project, as well as testing them with academic students and staff. And this is my last slide because I just wanted to summarize for you what aims we came up with by the end of this project. We defined 6 really quite specific aims for our preferred future for digital education. One was around this idea of playfulness and experimentation. So back to this idea about corporations telling us the stories about what we should be doing as educators. Let's kind of move away from that. Let's actually put technology into the hands of teachers and of students and get people to make edtech, get people to develop little kind of sort of apps and things that they want to do in their classroom. Let's empower, rather than seeing all educational technology as about big implementations of LMSs and so on. Let's actually put technology into the hands of students and teachers. So that was one of our aims. Another was to be very community focused, and I mentioned this before. All our decision making at an institutional level should be about edtech, which builds and strengthens the community, however that community is defined, whether it's students on the campus or the global community of 2 million people on our distance courses. Another one was this to be post-digital, to really work with being a post-digital university. So by post-digital, I mean we've moved away from this sense that technology, that the distance learning and technology-enhanced learning happens here and the rest happens here on campus, to actually acknowledge that technology is fully embedded in all our everyday lives, and let's design our teaching to take account of that. Data fluency was another one. We wanted to be a highly data fluent university. We will have to be in the future. But data fluency isn't just about knowing how to crunch data or how to use data or how to make data-informed decisions. It's also about understanding the social impact of data and having a critical perspective on that, which can only come from humanities and social sciences. So yes, let's do data skills and data science education, but let's also value and put at the center of what we do the critical approaches to data that we also need. We want to have a future which is assessment-oriented. We want to kind of move away from this idea that assessment is a burden, that exams and final essays are kind of troublesome, and they are troublesome in terms of the time they take to mark and the stress levels they put on students. But let's look at technology which helps us make assessment more interesting, makes it better, more fun and more engaging. And then finally, let's look at boundary challenging technologies. Let's really use technology to reach beyond national boundaries. Let's educate the world where it's appropriate to do so, but let's also educate beyond our disciplines. Let's really embed technology which helps us think in a transdisciplinary way. So those are the aims we came up with, and we're now at this phase where we have to actually think about how do we achieve them. So if you have time to look at the final report from this project, there's a whole load of actual actionable actions that we are going to take to build this particular future that we've defined. And I think on that, I'm going to finish. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we've got 10 minutes for questions, so I'll leave 10 minutes for questions, and we can follow up in the kind of keynote conversation afterwards as well. But I would just like to thank you all for listening and taking part.